This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online hemophilia community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info, like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos, the best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type in livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar, and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as they put the live in Living with Hemophilia. You can even like them on Facebook. That's even better because then you can use emojis on their Facebook page and receive all the latest updates. So check out Living with Hemophilia. And before you wish happy birthday to some friend from the third grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of the Ask the Expert podcast. On this episode, we're going to dive into how art, in its various forms, can impact someone's life with a bleeding disorder, and how art has become a powerful part of our community. We'll also get into some advice around how to find the art form that you can connect with, and how to get started. I'm your host, Chris Bombardier, and let's get started with the episode. I'm extremely excited to interview today's guest for the Ask the Expert podcast, Justin Levesque, not only because he is one of my close friends, but also because his various art projects have inspired me and opened my eyes to the expansive nature of the art world. Justin also founded and created Bloodwork, which is a display of art created by individuals impacted by bleeding disorders at the National Hemophilia Foundation's annual meeting for the last 5 years. I'll let Justin dive more in depth into his various projects and accomplishments because I will not do them justice. So let's get started. And thank you, Justin, for joining us here today.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
To start us off, you have a bleeding disorder and you're an extremely talented artist. Do you think your bleeding disorder inspired you to pursue art, or were you steered toward art because of your bleeding disorder?
Oh, well, thanks for the compliment. I think that creativity for me was really important. I think because of the time period that I grew up in, which, sort of being born in the late 80s or mid 80s, prophy sort of wasn't as much of the protocol that was around in terms of how you would treat a bleed. It was mostly on-demand treating. And so those kinds of physical things like, football or soccer, I really wanted to play soccer when I was in elementary school, sort of were less on the table for options. And so my natural gravitation towards creativity and art making was just, further enhanced or happening because sort of that reality. And it wasn't, a situation where, my parents were saying, you can't do this. Why don't you try doing this? It was more of like, that's going to be really complicated and could be really hard for you to do. If that's something you want to try, we can certainly think about it. But are you really that interested, or would you rather be doing this? Tell us a little bit more about kind of how you want to approach it. And at the end of the day, I think for me, I was only moderately interested in those other kinds of things. And the idea of spending more time making artwork or being creative was much more appealing to me. So that's sort of the route I went instead.
Yeah, do you think it was like some sort of outside pressures that were kind of steering you towards sports maybe? And like that's the normal thing that people do? For
sure. I had like some friends who were in, playing soccer. I really had no interest in football or anything else like that, but soccer was definitely something I thought was kind of cool. And I had some friends who were doing it, and probably I wanted to, hang out with them and be part of that. For as long as I can remember, I think I was always very cognizant of this idea of having to use my body in this way that would be like an acknowledgement of like some sort of successful accomplishment. And, I think that was kind of complicated to wrestle with and figure out as a young person, with a bleeding disorder, how can I maybe be successful in that or not? I had severe hemophilia A. So I have severe hemophilia A. So those kinds of things were, just sort of part of the daily conversation in terms of a reconciliation of what is my reality, what is the reality of those around me, what I really want to do actually. And, I think that it was an opportunity to really like have a direct and frank conversation about like what is it, that I actually really enjoyed. And I was lucky enough, that my parents sort of did that with me, which was nice.
Very cool. That's awesome. Do you have a moment that you remember during your childhood that like you created your first, what you would call like piece of art or like intentionally creative work? Do you have like any moment that you remember that distinctly? Or
I was part of a community on the internet when I was in like the 8th grade where it was, before Facebook, before MySpace, before like any of these sort of social networks, where people who were interested in like creativity and like coding with HTML, we would all like have these like loosely connected group of websites where we would like make a design and then showcase, on our own personal sites, like different photography that we were doing or different like poems we were writing or, whatever kind of creativity it was. And we would sort of support each other in this way. And so I remember, making a friend named Allison Wu, and she was from Toronto, and she was like an art major at school there. And I thought like, whoa, that is so cool. And she was a photographer. And so, I got a camera that year and just started making work. So, and that was like really supported in this sort of online other world that I was cultivating. It's a little bit different now. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend 8th graders doing some of the things that I did on the internet in terms of making friends and talking to people on the phone and all that kind of stuff. But at the time, it was a little less scary, I think, than it might be now. But it was really important to like how I approached my creative practice at a young age.
I think it's interesting. So like, how did you discover that platform that other artists existed on that? And obviously that had a big impact on the direction that your art kind of took towards a little bit more like photography. But like, how did you find it, and how did you know that it was even there? Because I think, for our listeners, some of them are thinking about arts in general, and like, I don't know how to get started in that. I don't know how to find people that are interested in things. How did you find that, and like, what are other avenues to kind of find those people to find out about new different forms of art that you probably never even heard of?
At the time it was just like making a website and looking around. I mean, honestly, it's been a while now. I can't remember exactly how that all kind of came together, but for me, photography was a really important place to start because, while I certainly, had some aptitude in other areas, like drawing or whatever, it definitely wasn't like something I was amazing at. And photography became this like sort of not easy, but a different kind of way of making an image with a medium that kind of took out that sort of like rendering something directly like from your brain, like onto a piece of paper. I could sort of use the medium and use the tool to almost like take stock of my environment and then respond to it, with a camera and with film at the time. So I think that was sort of an interesting, way of making images that sort of represented the world around me and sort of my experience. And I think that's a really great exercise for lots of folks to start out trying to think about like how they might make artwork or look at creative practice is photography. I think it can be like a low barrier of entry in terms of, especially now you can sort of use digital cameras. And actually, like if I was like talking to a young person today who, was into creative stuff, I would actually even like get them disposable cameras or something at first, because there's like, there's actually a good thing about having like a limit, of 25, because then you have to think a little bit more about like what kind of picture you're taking versus like digital, is infinite. But then, then you can kind of, scale up from there depending on what you're interested in. But I think that's always a great route is like disposable cameras or like even like less great digital cameras that have been sitting in your closet forever because you have a new one, and like, just giving those to an 8-year-old and just like seeing what they do with it.
Yeah, that's a really cool perspective, because I think I consider myself like not very artistic. And I know that you kind of have encouraged me to not think of myself that way, because I think everybody has a creative side. And I think that's a really, really cool way to think about, and get people to view the world in a creative way, is just by taking a picture from the perspective you see, because that's going to be a unique perspective from anybody else, right?
Yeah, I mean, the other way of kind of working is, that you take tons and tons of pictures, with a digital, or we used to do it with like tons of rolls of film, and then you can look at those images, the collective of all those images, and start working on another skill, which is called editing, and sort of thinking about, this large amount of pictures, and then making relationships between images that you maybe wouldn't even think would go with each other, and how these images kind of create a narrative if you kind of pair them or put them in a sequence together. And then you create one narrative, and then maybe you change them up, and you can see how like 4 of those same images with one new one creates a different kind of story. And I think that's a kind of fun process for like for how we engage like young people's minds about like what is constructing a narrative, and that narrative can be kind of in your own control, the narrative of yourself, the narrative of you with a bleeding disorder, like all of those things are like totally up to the person. It's up to you. It's in your control for the most part, and you might be like dealt a certain set of cards, right? But if you kind of move those images around or move those cards around, you're changing the story given what you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your definition of art? Because I think that's something that people also have this like preconceived notion that art is paintings and these, elaborate things. But what's your definition of art, and how do you view art?
That's a good question. It's a hard one. And it's probably, my answer is going to be very specific to my approach. But I actually, it's so funny. Like I kind of always cringe when I say, I'm an artist. It's just like, it's so loaded with a kind of like, I don't know, like it's just not a thoughtful profession or something, or that it's an easy one, or I don't know, I have my own hangups about that word itself. And so I usually actually kind of, and I just think it doesn't describe enough for me what it is that I'm trying to do. So I like to think of it in terms of creative practice. And I think that is also an easier way for folks who are thinking about, is what I'm doing art? Well, that's not, that's not a great question for yourself. I think when you're doing is what I'm doing part of my creative practice? Yeah, and so what is creativity and what is practice for you when you're making something? And so, yes, of course you have painting and you have drawing and you have silk screening or printmaking or photography. And all of those things can be part of a creative practice for sure. The most important part is that and this isn't something maybe that happens right away, but it's something that happens over time, is that you begin to develop basically like a way of making choices. And so like for me, that's the biggest part of like what creates an artwork or defines a creative practice, is that you are making choices throughout that process about like, is it going to be red? Is it going to be blue? Am I going to put this image next to this one? How, what am I trying to make or say when I'm participating in this process, right? And so that choice making, though, is a skill that really helps you in a lot of areas. Making a choice is something that then you sort of stand behind and you have to feel confident about making. And so then it helps to create, more confident choice making in other areas of your life as well. So I think that's one of the most important part of a creative or artistic practice is just learning how to make choices, how to stand by those choices. And then Duchamp, who was a sculptor, in the modern era, put, like a toilet bowl in a gallery and said, this is art, right? But he was confident about that. And at the time, people didn't think it was art. Maybe people don't think it's art today still, but there was some, I think the most audacious part about it and what makes it art is that he said it was, and that was a choice. And now everyone's having this conversation about whether or not it is. And that's kind of the point, right? Just to get people talking.
Yeah. I think that really actually helped me kind of have a better understanding of art too, and then the fact that it's not just the creative process, but it's also being able to kind of have that confidence that your creative process is art, right? Like it's having that confidence that like that, that was an intentional thing, that it's making a statement of some sort and having some confidence about what that statement is. That's actually the artistic part of it, right? It's not, it's your perspective too, which I think that's the thing that I've learned a lot from your stuff, is that it's about the expression of the artist and seeing it. It's their expression of their perspective, which is really powerful to see.
Yeah, I mean, and not everything creative has to necessarily, have a huge statement. I mean, there's kind of two spectrums of it. There's this spectrum on one side, which is, very intentional choice making. There's another side, which is kind of more like of a mindfulness thing. I mean, in the last, 5 years, coloring books like went crazy, right? And there's some like merit definitely to like just like zoning out and getting some colored pencils and, spending an hour like filling in a drawing, like in this coloring book kind of way. And there's like a mindfulness, maybe like distraction component to it, which is actually like great for like when you're trying to like ignore the pain of a bleed or something like that, for sure. But it's still, I think, like you're engaging your mind in like making something externally of yourself. You're putting pen to paper, you're putting color pencil in the book, and that still, I think, it just engages your brain like in a way that is maybe different than, something else, I guess, like reading a book. Because like you're reading a book, you're like internalizing those words, right? And then sort of drawing or coloring book thing or whatever, you're sort of externalizing. And I think a lot of times that externalization of a thought or the externalization of like of a skill or color or whatever, it can be like scary sometimes. So creative practice, I think, can actually be like, you're really putting yourself like out there.
This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos. The best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as they put the live in living with hemophilia. You can even like them on Facebook, and that's even better because then you can use emojis on their Facebook page and receive all the latest updates. So, check out Living with Hemophilia. And before you wish happy birthday to that friend from 3rd grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
So you mentioned being creative, or even doing the coloring in a color book is a great way to like distract yourself from a bleed or the pain of a bleed. Has that ever been something that you've relied on when you're living with your bleeding disorder? And have you seen your bleeding disorder kind of expressed through any artworks that you've created?
I mean, definitely art as a distraction for me was important. I mean, honestly, like video games to me and like TV and film are totally part of the art world. So, just like watching those or playing those were big distractions for me. And I think that they totally qualify in a lot of ways. So there's that. And then a lot of times, like I would have for years and years, my camera was attached to me. And so, I was documenting kind of like my experience with the bleeding disorder for many years with that camera. And so through a bleed or whatever, I would be, continuously making images about that experience. I mean, in some twisted way, it would be like, oh, great, I got a bleed. Now I can take pictures again. Not really, but, it's like, here's a chance to do it. It was kind of like, a half glass full kind of situation when that would happen sometimes. But then, I don't know, maybe, when I was 25, I developed an inhibitor. And I kind of just finished undergrad in the last couple of years, and where I got a bachelor's of fine arts, and I was thinking about, what was next in terms of creative practice. And then I developed this inhibitor, and then, the the work I was making really changed from being less about my body and then becoming really like a lot about my body and the way that I was experiencing the world through this body. Having a hemophilia severe with an inhibitor, you kind of are just thinking about like, your knees, your legs, your arms, your head, your body, just like 24/7 all the time. And so inherently, just because of what I was thinking about, like it sort of shows up in the work that I was making, like up until now. So consistently, it may not be like overtly like bruise or, like limping around or something like that, but it's kind of always somewhat present in the work that I'm making. And that's because it really, it's the lens in which I experience everything, So, a couple of years ago now, I did this artist residency in the Arctic Circle. It's called the Arctic Circle Artist Residency, where I was sailing on a tall ship for about 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks up in Svalbard, which is an archipelago north of Norway. And I was there with, 29 other artists, scientists, writers, musicians. We were sailing through fjords and there's glaciers and people are making landings to shore and climbing them. And I had an active inhibitor while I was up there. And, it was like, here are 29 people who are experiencing this place with a body that, for the most part, I know maybe making some assumptions, but for the most part, they can just do those things without having to think too much about like what's happening like with my legs, what's happening with my knees. Whereas my experience was like so contrasted to that, and that I was infusing multiple times a day and trying to make the best of it. And I had to make really hard choices. Like, I'm only going to climb one glacier today, or I'm not going to climb any glaciers today. But then the work that I would be making sort of while I was there, it wasn't about having hemophilia in the Arctic, but the fact that I had hemophilia in the Arctic is present in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that work that I've seen is just spectacular. I think when you told me you were going to go on a tall ship in the Arctic, I was really pumped for you. And then I thought about your inhibitor too, and I was like, wow, I don't know how he's going to manage that. And obviously you did an amazing job, and your artwork that came from that was spectacular. Also, your video of infusing while sitting off on the iceberg with the tall ship in the background was spectacular. It was the coolest thing I've ever seen. But
well, I was really nervous. I'll be fully honest. Like, I was super nervous about being there with an inhibitor and like what that was going to mean. And and the last thing I wanted was to have to get medevaced or something like out of 80 degrees north and disrupt the experience for 29 other people in this way. That was kind of like nerve-wracking, but at the same time, like, I wanted to like disclose, that I had this, disorder to the other artists that were there. And so anyway, I was really, really nervous about it. And luckily, this Gut Monkey program happened right before I was going to go. It was a camp for, young adults with inhibitors. And I thought, oh, I can't do that. That's like too much. And I'm like, wait a second. If I'm going to go to the Arctic with an inhibitor, I think I can do this camp. It's going to be fine. So that was like really nice practice for me to try to go to do that at Camp Collins with the Gut Monkey crew, was to like practice out that some of the more adventurous things that they do there, but within my limits, and also that was an opportunity to practice saying no, if like something was like just going to be too much for me, or if I was like having like doubts about it, and like being okay with saying no. No is like a totally like fine thing to say. So I really got to do that there, and then it just like also informed how I then experienced the artist residency up there for sure. Was like, I'm just gonna like make sure my body is fine, and the work that I'm gonna make is gonna be the work that I'm gonna make while I'm there, and it's gonna be fine. So it was this kind of like, like a feedback loop almost of like the community helping me do this thing that I really want to do, which is sort of like maybe crazy, and then all of the things that I'm doing there sort of maybe coming back full circle to like inform how I experience the community.
I just want to touch on one point that you mentioned there, like the fact that it's okay to say no. I think that's something that I struggled with for a long time growing up, with sports, is like and trying to like, feel like I could keep up with people. And I never say no, and then I'd end up with like the worst bleed I've ever had, because I just was like, oh, I can't say no. I have to do this. I have to keep going. And I think that's such a good lesson to learn of like, yeah, we do have this condition that we have to live with, and we have to figure out when it's okay to say no. And it is okay to say no. I mean, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't, step outside of your comfort zone and try new things, like going to the Arctic Circle on a tall ship. But while you're there, you might have to self-limit yourself, depending on your situation. So I think that's a really great lesson to learn.
And I don't think of it as like self-limiting. I think it's about like self-directing an experience based on the parameters of your reality, right? What is a good thing and what is not a great thing for my body right now? Like, what within that can I do that's going to like give me the best experience that I can have?
Yeah, that was a much better way of phrasing that.
I mean, I only say it because I just know some folks who will wallow sometimes and it's really heartbreaking, when we can't get past ourselves. I mean, I'm guilty of it too at some points in time, of course. We can't see what's right in front of us in terms of it's like a really amazing experience, and you're just like bummed out the whole entire time because you can't have the same experience that everyone else is having. And again, I think part of that is about like, well, okay, then if I can't have that experience, how do I take this environment around me, respond to it, and externalize it in a way that is, unique to my perspective?
I mean, your tall ship was an amazing adventure, and I think a lot of times people think of art as being like in a studio or behind a camera or more, I don't know, stationary, I guess. But you've got to do so the Arctic trip, but you also got to take a container ship from Portland, Maine to Iceland. So you've done a couple really amazing things. So art has kind of expanded your world. Would you say like you've got to experience more things because of your art, and where do you see it going from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the project that I did was I partnered with a shipping company, an Icelandic shipping company that has a headquarters here in Maine, and proposed to them that I go on their container ship and sail from here to Iceland. It took 9 days. And it absolutely expanded my world. I've been obsessed with Iceland for as long as I can remember. And then for Iceland to kind of like plop down in my backyard and make Maine their headquarters, I was a little like, flabbergasted and knew I had to kind of do something with it. And the project that came out of that was, I did some audio of interviews with the crew members of the ship and made like a little podcast about it. And then I was photographing life at sea, and then making some more like other introspective works about like, how we think about the ocean and what it sort of means to be away from home. And, the result of that was this interesting intersection between like art and like commerce almost, that we can like look at the shipping world, right, or ships at sea and find creative practice or creativity like within that. And so a lot of my work and the way that I approach art making is trying to identify intersections of art with something else, and that constantly then is sort of engaging participants or conversations with folks who don't normally think about art. And so I always find that to be really engaging. It's the same kind of mentality that I use when I like approach art making within the bleeding disorders community as well. There's an intersection there between potentially, art and medicine, or art and community. And there's actually a name for art and community. It's called social practice. And so a lot of times you can have a social art making practice, which basically just means like getting communities of people to kind of make artwork together and sort of try to impact some kind of change within that community, whether it's, mental change or policy change, whatever. And so those kinds of approaching art through thinking about intersections is a really great way of connecting with folks that you never would have thought like would have ever entertained your voice in that conversation, as well as contributing their voice to a conversation. So I always find it to be really fruitful.
Is that kind of what inspired you to create Folks, that kind of intersection between hemophilia and community? And if people don't know what Folks is, could you kind of explain what that is and how it came to be?
Yeah, so Folks, which is FOLX, which kind of like in a jokey way, but in a real way stands for Friends of the Letter X. and then I'm kind of like nerding out with the X in terms of like algebra, like X being a variable. So whatever your X is kind of like something that folks is trying to like celebrate and acknowledge through creativity. So it's like, is your X having hemophilia? Is your X having von Willebrand's? Is your X having an inhibitor? And I would say that the intersection part of it is a component of the project and something I'm thinking about maybe a little more behind the scenes. But the real drive to have folks come out with creative programming like the Bloodwork Art Exhibition or the Art Stars like youth program was initially a response to developing an inhibitor and sort of realizing, that there was this cohort or this minority of people within the bleeding disorders community who were having a really tough go of it comparatively, and thinking about how, in my perspective anyways, a lot of the times when people were being sort of celebrated within the community, that folks were being celebrated for like accomplishments that like they would use their body for. And I wanted to just create a space where, especially for those minority groups, where they could also be celebrated for maybe something that they were doing. Creativity and the creative economy in general is like a really viable space, I think, for people with bleeding disorders to think about pursuing in terms of like careers and money making. I mean, those are like, everyone has to like get a job and make money, right? And
yeah,
whether you're doing, whether you're going to a 4-year art school or you're going to a vocational program or anything like that, I mean, all those things, in the long term might provide for you, longer, or when you're 50, right, than perhaps like trying to bag groceries on your feet when you're 50 years old. I mean, something wrong with that, but when you're thinking about like bleeding disorders and how your life and your reality, the parameters of your reality are somewhat different, sometimes you have to kind of like be thinking a little more long term, a little younger than most of the people around you. And so I think, the creative economy is I think was an overlooked at the time anyway, like avenue that folks in the bleeding disorders community should be thinking about. You look at a can of soup in your cabinet, someone designed that label. You look all around you and you can see evidence of folks who had to design something or make something. You look at like benches at the airport, someone designed those, right? And all these things they use your sort of brain and some technical skills that you can learn in 2 years through a program. And they can, provide a livelihood for, the rest of your life if you keep working at it. So, so it's kind of about acknowledging, creative success, creating a framework for people to think about different kinds of jobs they could pursue in that area. And then also, I mean, people just really empowering to take something that someone has made and put it on a wall and to sort of to mimic or, participate in if you go to the Smithsonian, you see artwork on the wall, right? I mean, those people are important because they're on the wall. So to mimic that kind of approach to showing the artwork of our community was, I think, can be really empowering in that way to the individuals who participate. And lastly, folks was also, I think, a response to how images of the bleeding disorder community are often represented to us from a lot of external forces. And those images aren't always necessarily like nefarious or bad, but they are not necessarily images made by us. So you walk through the NHF exhibit hall, and you look at all the manufacturers or the specialty pharmacies or the different, organizations that are in there. There's a lot of images like on these banners and stuff that are like actors or doing, things that maybe we actually don't do or what have you. And so I think folks was in a space where we can have the community participate in making images that represent ourselves, for ourselves, by ourselves.
And I would have to say that it's been really fun to walk through those exhibits the last few years and see that and see the expression of our community through these works of art on the wall, or even through music, which has been really, really fun to see. And I love the contrast because it's usually close to the exhibit hall of our art, our community art, within the same space as the like you said, all those external kind of things that are representing our community. So it's kind of a cool like juxtaposition. I think that's the right word.
Yeah, because the Bloodwork Art Exhibition is always in the exhibit hall, and so to have that there and have those kind of those other images, external images, sort of around it, you kind of go from one to the other, and it can actually be like a little like jarring, but like in a good way. It sort of like snaps you out of like all the like flashing lights, So there's definitely, I love that it's in that space for that reason exactly. And you're right. There's there's a musical component for sure, which is definitely another part of creative practice. I played upright bass all through jazz band, like high school, and making music is definitely something that can be both, again, that meditative like process where you're kind of like just looking at maybe the notes on the paper or the tabs for guitar, and you're just kind of like using your brain really focused like on that one thing. But also if you begin to like, if you get rid of the paper, right, and you kind of just like improv or improvise with your instrument, whether that's your voice or what have you, that's all about choice making and sort of expressing whatever it is that you're feeling that day. And it's not like everything you're doing is being recorded and pressed to CD or MP3 and made live right away. There's not an expectation that it's going to be ready for everyone to hear. It can just be for you in that moment. Every artwork that I make definitely doesn't get exhibited. It's sort of all about, I've probably said this word like a million times already, but it's all about like practice.
I'm sure that the folks program is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, with no pun intended, with your your trip to the Arctic. But where would you like to see art programming go in the community? Like, what are some of your big dreams and goals to bring this more to the forefront?
Art in the community in the future. Obviously, I would very much like to continue the Bloodwork Art exhibitions for, as long as that can be sustained, for sure. I think that it would be wonderful if other stakeholders within the community bought into the process more, maybe thought about how artists or creative folks in the community could be like compensated for their work. I think is really important. Is compensating artists is really an important thing. And then teaching creative folks in the community that you should be looking to be compensated for your work is always, and how to do that, I think is sort of tricky. I think programming around the creative economy and what those opportunities may be, that your art can certainly be a practice that's like, I make art for myself. That's definitely one way of doing it, sure. But the other way of doing it is that like you're making art and you're putting it in the world to kind of like say something or participate in a conversation, and how you can leverage your unique perspective as a way to potentially, even create income. I think that's the course or the path to that is murky, so helping folks figure that out, I think would be a cool, way of doing that. And I would love, if in some instances, like where, I don't know, at this year NHF, you were walking through these long hallways and you see these huge banners, like, outside the exhibit hall that were sort of advertisements. I would love if, we could get a manufacturer or someone to kind of like be like, what, instead of our banner this year, we're going to like do a huge painting that's been printed on vinyl and we're going to put that up there instead, or whatever it may be, and kind of allow the artwork to break free from the gallery space and be more integrated into the experience space of these meetings.
That would be awesome. I could picture it now. Like, that would be so amazing. And also like the hallway, maybe even to the exhibit hall with just displays of artwork the whole way. Like, that's what you walk through to the exhibit hall would be so cool. So Justin, how can people get involved in Folks program, and the Bloodwork exhibit at the annual meeting?
So we put out a call for art generally 2 months before the annual meeting dates. We broadcast that call for ART on the Facebook page, which if you just search FOLX, it should pop up. But it's also posted on our website, which is folks.org. So that's two of them, folx.org. And you submit, using an online form, your information and some images. And I always, suggest, if people are going to submit, submit more than one image, like definitely submit, 3 or 4. And then what happens is that the submissions, they go through like a light jurying process, whereas, there's a couple of things that we have to think about, content-wise. We have to kind of make sure everything's family-friendly a little bit. But also, we have a limited amount of space, and so we want to make sure everything is represented. And so sometimes we'll take like 2 of the artworks instead of the 4 that you submitted. But that allows us to kind of make some pairings or to think about what kind of work is going to be in the show and how they kind of relate to each other. And the jurying process is something that if you are going to participate as a creative person in like the art world, quote unquote, that you'll have to get used to doing because it's very common part of that practice. So that's a practice in itself, is getting able to kind of try out what is a jurying process. And then it goes up. And so we just coordinate, shipping the artwork, or oftentimes, if a lot of times it's like precious to the artist. And so if they send us a high-res image, we will print the image for them at no cost to the artist, and then bring the print of the artwork and display that instead. And so luckily we've been very fortunate to have sponsors that sort of pay for the shipping to get artworks there and to pay for the exhibits so far. And so we have been able to do that with the support of NHF and Biomatrix.
Awesome. And finally, where can people see your works of art from your Arctic trip?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's onedynamicsystem.com. That's ONEDYNAMICSYSTEM.com. And that sort of has like projects on it that have grouped images like based on the actual project. But then works in progress, things that I'm just kind of like playing around with, can be found on my Instagram, which is all the same name, One Dynamic System. And right now, I've been doing an artist in residence at the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in Booth Bay Harbor. And I've been just going up there like one day a week for a few weeks now, and like hanging out with scientists who are researching ancient viruses in lakes from Antarctica, and figuring out how I can maybe make some artwork about that.
That sounds super cool. So thank you, Justin, for joining us today. And we will put links to folks and the Bloodwork page, and also to Justin's artwork in the program notes for the episode. And we will definitely encourage people, if you have anything you want to submit to Bloodwork next year, please do so. It's a really great exhibit, and it's cool to see your art up on the wall. So thank you again, Justin.
Thanks, Chris.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join this exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the ol' internet. I think you're going to love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on Living with Hemophilia's Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. I mean, unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
And that is all for the Ask the Expert podcast. We'll be back next month with another expert interview. BloodstreamMedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorders community. Once on BloodstreamMedia.com, don't forget to follow the links to subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast, Ask the Expert podcast, Powering Through podcast, and the Bloodline podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Have a question you would like to hear an expert answer to? Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on Facebook at facebook.com/Bloodstream Media and on Twitter at Bloodstream Info. This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Chris Bombardier, produced by Patrick James Lynch, Rob Bradford, Joshua Sterling Bragg, Alva Friedman, and Colby Crow. Artwork by Ryan Geelan and Katie Wright Mead, and the Ask the Expert pod is edited by Allison Stoney. I'm your host, Chris Bombardier, and until next time, keep on climbing.